welcome to Foolish Musings. Today we will be discussing China's most famous philosopher, Confucius. As per usual, I'd like to start off this presentation with some disclaimers. I'd like to talk about the fact that Confucius is a rather contentious figure, and I'll go through three of the most significant reasons why there's still a lot of concern with regards to Confucius in modern thought. So, when China went through the very painful process of modernization in the 19th and 20th centuries, Confucius became associated with all aspects of Chinese society that was seen as anti-modern and as retarding the growth of the Chinese nation. And because of this, in both the nationalist and then communist narrative, Confucius was seen as a target to be smashed rather than as a person of intellectual heritage which the Chinese nation could draw upon. In recent years, Confucius has made a comeback in China, and this has been seen through his wide readership and also his propagation throughout the world in the form of Chinese soft power. And this is where it's become more contentious because Confucianism and Confucius and Confucian studies is seen as a mechanism by which some nationalistic and even some ethnically chauvinistic ideas and practices are being pushed. Finally, from a Western perspective, there has been a certain tendency to mysticize Confucius, to turn him into some sort of sacred sage of the East, rather than examine his ideas and his philosophy thoroughly, but also from the perspective of a thinker and as a human, rather than this rather orientalizing sort of concept. And this is important to look at because if you read Confucius's works, as I hope you do after this particular video, I think that you'll find that although later Confucians and later Chinese thinkers did turn Confucius into some sort of like semi-divine, uncrowned king figure, the actual writings that were attributed to his students and his students' students depict someone who is much more human and much more approachable. So we now turn to the question, who was Confucius? And this is an interesting question because unlike what you might have thought, we don't actually have any primary sources that were written by Confucius himself. It's much like Socrates in the Western tradition. We have this figure who is so important for developing and starting this train of thought, but at the same time he is without his own words to defend his own philosophy or to put forth his own ideas. We do have one document called the Analects, which is based upon a compilation of writings believed to have been written by the students of some of his students, but including some additions for several centuries afterwards. It took several centuries for the final document actually to come to a fixed state, which would be circulated throughout China, throughout the rest of its history. But we have a lot of sort of secondary source material which also depicts a character who serves and lives in this very interesting and very dynamic period of Chinese history. So what do I mean by this period of Chinese history? And this is where the historical context becomes extremely important for those of us that want to understand Confucius and his thought. So Confucius was living in Zhao era China, which was right before the Warring States period, which many of you may be familiar with. He lived for most of his life in a small state called Lu, right near the Shandong Peninsula in northern China today, and he spent a large period of his life trying to get access to and work in the service of the local aristocracy and local kings who ruled over the many small states which comprised China at this period. In some ways, he spent the large majority of his life never actually fulfilling his dream of being a civil servant. He was employed for a short period of time in his home state of Lu when he was forced out, potentially by factionalism within some of the aristocratic families that were living and working under the monarch of Lu. And then he spent several decades wandering China attempting to find someone who would accept his teachings and who would put them into practice as a sovereign. Eventually he did return to Lu, where he spent the last few years of his life trying to transmit his teachings Now, later Confucians and later Neo-Confucians would wrap layers of mysticism and almost theology around the character of Confucius, and it would make him a figure that would become extremely important in terms of the religious aspects of China, despite the fact that as an actual teacher, he was in some ways very secular. He was very avid in his pursuit of becoming an official, and in some ways, being a teacher was a secondary occupation that he fell back on because of his failure to get a place in one of the courts around China. As an individual, he doesn't really deal with the divine, with cosmology, with sort of those aspects of the supernatural, and as such, he's very much a secular kind of character. He's somebody who's worried about the here and the now and how we should act in this life. And this separates him from a lot of other Chinese thinkers who would come later, as well as other traditions of thought across the world. And in some ways, he's seen as a bit of a tragic figure. He's a person who was striving to propagate his teachings and to try and change China dramatically away from the path of violence, of factionalism, something that he saw as endemic within his own time, and he sort of forecast the chaos and destruction that would occur in the Warring States period. So he shares with Socrates the position of the tragic figure. So we now move to the very difficult aspect of attempting to systemize Confucius's thought, and this is a more difficult task than one would think, primarily because of the very aphoristic nature of the Analects. Confucius didn't lay out a system of thought which we could easily absorb and easily dissect. Instead, we have this collection of pithy sayings, which are quite difficult to understand in some regards if you don't necessarily have an understanding of the cultural and historical context in which they are arising. So what I'll attempt to do now is to lay out some of the basic tenets of Confucian thought, noting that we have received his teachings mediated through those that followed him. The first concept one must understand to understand the thought of Confucius is that of filial piety. Now, filial piety is this rather clunky English term, and it refers to the fact that one has a duty to respect and to follow the wishes of one's parents. And it's a very important concept in Confucianism because Confucianism is a very social philosophy, and it sees the importance of the relationship between people and the glue that holds these relationships together as being of utmost importance to ensuring the success of a society and a state. It has been argued that filial piety and this focus on hierarchy has created a situation in China where there is a sort of rigidity throughout the majority of its history, and that rigidity had to be removed through the destruction of Confucianism because people could no longer question authority or question their parents or act outside of these sort of nepotistic norms. However, this isn't necessarily completely true, because even though filial piety towards one's own parents and also piety towards one's ruler, an extremely important aspect of Confucianism, they also point towards this concept of remonstrance. Now, remonstrance is this idea that not only do you have a duty to follow the wishes and orders and commands of your superior and of your parents, but you also have a duty to correct them when they're wrong. And this can be at even the risk of one's own death. So there are many stories in later Chinese culture of Confucian officials turning up to remonstrate their emperors and dragging their coffins behind them, full well knowing that the punishment for their act of remonstrance could be death. So it's not as simple as just saying that Confucianism supports this blind idea of hierarchy, but it's this idea that by showing filial piety, you actually need to be willing to correct those who are superior to you when they're wrong, but also be willing to accept the punishment that comes with that correction. The next concept that we'll talk about in Confucianism is the concept of loyalty, and it is very much allied to these ideas of filial piety and remonstrance. So the word that we translate into loyalty could also be translated as exerting all of one's efforts, and in some way this is a better translation, although definitely less pithy. So it's about not necessarily just having blind loyalty up and down the chain, but be willing to exert every aspect of one's character in order to make sure that things go right within the state, right within the household, and right for one's superiors. It's about not just being willing to hide things, to cover things up, to allow for a superior to make a mistake and then not confront them but just back them up when they are confronted by the failure of their plans. But it's about making sure that you put yourself fully into the aspect of being a subordinate and of being an official or a soldier or a farmer or whatever your role is within society. And it's very much based upon this idea of reciprocity as well. It's this idea that loyalty goes both up and down, and that your loyalty up will be reciprocal with the individual who is in command or in charge, and who will be acting in the best interest of all those below them. And so it's not necessarily this idea of individualistic loyalty to a single individual, but it's loyalty up and down the entire strand of society. Allied to this concept of loyalty are two separate concepts which kind of bind together to provide an underlying structure upon which all human interactions are conducted in a Confucian-style society. And these are trust and sincerity. So trust in this concept of Confucian thought isn't necessarily the trust between two single individuals. It's more about being true to one's word, what in a more archaic form of English we might consider being a person of one's word. And sincerity is about making sure that you act with the best interests in your heart for those within your society, within your household, and those that are both your subordinate and your superior. And it's that sort of interweaving aspects of trust and sincerity that provide the framework by which an individual will put forth all their effort as an aspect of loyalty within a Confucian society. Following on from these aspects of sincerity and trust and loyalty, which I hope you understand are very, very social concepts within the Confucian schema of thought, we now move to the aspect of Confucianism which sort of drives an individual to act with a social conscience down the chain, and that is this concept of empathy. It's about relating to the needs of others, about not necessarily just feeling sorry for somebody else, but understanding specifically what they need and they require so that they can be the best person that they can be. It's about not using one's power to gain material wealth and goods for oneself, but rather understanding that one's position and power comes with a duty to those that are less fortunate and that need to be protected and influenced and cultivated by those that are above them. The final of these Confucian virtues that I will talk about is excellence. And previously this term has been translated as virtue, which comes with its own loaded baggage, particularly when we talk about virtue in a Platonic sense. But it's this idea of honing one's skills and abilities, constantly attempting to learn, to better oneself, in a sense trying to bring oneself to the sharpest point as possible, understanding that one constantly needs cultivation to be at the top of one's game, and not doing this for oneself, but understanding that one cultivates oneself so as to actually act in the world, to act in society and make society a better place, not only for oneself, but for all participants, for all people that are part of society. And so this concept of excellence is once again not an individual virtue, although it is dependent upon individual effort, but something that is socialized, something that is based around the idea of using all of one's effort to improve oneself, but for the benefit of others. So now that I've described the differing characteristics of Confucian virtues, I want to try and mesh them all together to give an understanding of how within this Confucian schema of thought the differing aspects of virtue interact with each other. So, for Confucius, filial piety and its matching concept of remonstrance form the basis of all action. It's the fundamental glue which holds societies together. For him, there was nothing worse than the idea of a breakdown of filial piety between individuals, which he saw as the only mechanism by which a state could survive. Building upon this base, the concepts of loyalty and sincerity and trust create that chain not only within one's family, but stretching all the way from ruler down to the lowliest member of a society. This is tempered by the ideas of empathy, which give that ruler and the elite class a feeling of reciprocity which needs to stretch all the way down, and excellence is seen as this idea of honing oneself so as to be able to provide the best possible outcome for all members of society, rather than an individual pursuit of power. And all of these things seem to be drawing in together, and they're pushing together this idea of what it means to be a good person, what it means to live a good life, and this all comes into this concept of consummate conduct. So consummate conduct is, it's not this dodgy concept of rules that define every aspect of one's life, although ritual is an important aspect of the Confucian ethic, but rather they're more like a target which one aims at as they attempt to go through life doing the best that is possible. And within this Confucian system of thought, consummate conduct is the target which is aimed at by the exemplary person. The exemplary person is someone who puts all their effort into making sure that they conduct their lives in line with consummate conduct. As I hope that you've seen throughout this video, Confucian ethics aren't something that is divorced of society. It's not focused on one's individual virtue. It's actually something that's based and centered upon one's role within a society, one's role within a culture or a state. And so it makes a lot of sense that when we talk about the exemplary person, that we talk about what is their role within a society. And for Confucius, the exemplary person was fundamental in upholding ritual. Now, this is the point at which many critics have argued that Confucius was nothing more than someone who's obsessed with bringing back this concept of a bygone era, where if only we followed the ways of our forefathers and foremothers, we wouldn't have to worry about the problems of the current world. And I think this is a bit of an unfair criticism, because Confucianism doesn't necessarily see ritual as good for ritual's sake. Even Confucius himself at several times remarks on not being particularly interested in understanding some of the more complex aspects of forgotten rituals. However, he sees rituals as being once again another aspect of this glue that holds together society. It's this glue that provides opportunities for people to peacefully interact with each other and provide the best possible outcome for all people involved. And if we think about this, even within our own societies, we have very important roles for rituals. It's the position of a teacher, and the fact that we give authority to a teacher by sitting in a class and listening to them and not interrupting them and not being rude or excitable or smashing the windows, that we actually participate in the ritual of attending a class. And if the ritual is broken at any stage, then the actual mechanism by which transference of learning occurs is also disrupted. This is not to suggest that rituals can be followed blindly. If a ritual doesn't actually contribute to the upholding of society and to the benefit of the people, this is to say that if a ritual doesn't cultivate the individuals involved, then perhaps the ritual needs to be examined in and of itself. I'd like to conclude with some thoughts about Confucius and his ideas. Confucius was not necessarily a fuddy-duddy, a reactionary who just wanted to bring back the classics, to bring back the old ways, and then everything would be okay. Confucius was very pragmatic, and his philosophy is incredibly social. It's about seeing the way the world is, and in his time it was incredibly violent and chaotic, and then attempting to change it into something that was better. And he did draw on the history of the past, and he did draw upon the example of the Zhou and the righteous emperors that went before him in this sort of semi-legendary heritage. But he was very cognizant of those aspects of society that he saw as unchanging and as essentially a part of human nature. Things such as the family, hierarchy, people that were superior and inferior. There was no sort of idea of equality that would permeate later Western thought. However, it's very easy to see with later thinkers of the Confucian stream how when this system of thought ends up being incorporated into the apparatus of the state, it becomes an aspect of oppression and repression. If one is willing to focus purely on rituals and on hierarchy, and not necessarily think about those aspects of remonstrance and of reciprocity, then one can very much create a society which is calcified and unable to change and modify. However, I think that we need to also focus on the fact that Confucius was in his own time a reformer. Confucius wasn't somebody who was just willing to accept the world the way as it was, or willing to lay back and let things happen. He was someone that was being very active in trying to create a better world. And I think it's within this light that we should review Confucius, not as a stultifying influence, but rather as someone who has a very genuinely interesting and important system of thought which we should consider in the 21st century. Thank you once again for listening to Foolish Musings. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more, please subscribe or follow me at my blog at foolishmusings.com.